Welcome to Means of Grace, a podcast produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church.
Welcome to the Means of Grace podcast. This is Kim Ingram, the Director of Ministerial Services and the Conference Secretary, and I'm your host today. And we're going to be having a conversation with Scott Osterberg. Scott has been the pastor at New Story United Methodist Church for 8 years and has recently written a book called Renegade Minitsry. And we're going to talk about his life and his ministry and the book and other resources that he offers. I'm very excited. I've been really looking forward to this conversation. Welcome, Scott.
Thanks, Kim. Glad to be here.
So I want to start the conversation just getting to know you a little bit for people who might not know you. You've been a member of the Western North Carolina Conference for a long time, but you grew up in Texas and you graduated from UT with your bachelor's and your MBA. And I was interested that you got an MBA before you went to Duke to seminary. And so must have had something in mind, sort of business related, and then turned toward something ministry related. And so I wondered if you'd tell us just a little bit about your story, and that might include your call.
Sure. I was one of those people who did not go to church much at all growing up. My family was not a church-going family. And in high school, I became part of a group called Young Life. And Young Life was where my Christian formation started. And so I actually, at Young Life, they said they wanted all of us to be going to a church on Sundays. And so I started going to a Methodist church not that far away from us. And it was a huge church in Richardson, Texas. And I would just sit in the back. And when I would sit in the back, I would just listen. And I still wasn't a churchy person at all. I never in a million years thought that I would be a minister or that I would go to seminary. I wanted to be a businessman. I wanted to be a business titan, actually. And so I went to UT and got my BBA and MBA and went to work for a firm called Donaldson, Lufkin, and Jenna, which is a Wall Street firm. Spent some time up in New York City and then came back to Dallas. And I loved my job, but I started feeling like that there was something more. There just had to be something more in life than making as much money as you could. And I found at the time, I started taking a class at SMU just for fun. I love to learn. And it happened to be through the divinity school at SMU. And the assistant dean was teaching it. And I absolutely loved studying about religion. I loved talking about religion. It was just fascinating to me. And so I thought, you know what? I think I'm going to go to seminary. I didn't think I would go to seminary to be a pastor. I thought I might want to teach religion. And I also knew I had an MBA from Texas, so I thought I could get a job pretty easily if it didn't work out. So I decided to go to seminary. Everybody I knew thought I was crazy. Like not one person thought it was a good idea, including my parents, including all of my friends. But I thought it was something that I should do. And so I went to Duke. And then I did my first field ed in the Western North Carolina Conference, and I loved being a pastor. Of course, I was just the field ed student, but I loved everything about what a pastor did. And it was the greatest thing because after that summer, I knew that that's what I was supposed to do, that I was supposed to be in the ministry. And so I'm a living example that the Lord works in very mysterious ways because when I decided that's what I was going to do and shared with my closest friends that I was going to be a pastor, all of my friends from Texas thought that was not a great idea. But I did it and I've never looked back, and it's the best decision I've ever made.
Well, so Scott, that kind of explains then the idea of renegade, because it seems like it's kind of in your DNA that renegade is kind of who you are, and even the experience of going to seminary and shifting gears was kind of a renegade experience for you because it wasn't part of your kind of background or history or how people knew you. Interesting. My call story is kind of based in Dallas, Texas, too, so we'll have to compare notes sometime. And this kind of leads into what I've wondered a lot as I've kind of watched you in ministry, because what you've just indicated is that you are able to kind of change gears and have changed gears along the way. And it seems you've been in ministry in Western North Carolina since 1996. And that kind of explains how you ended up in ministry in Western North Carolina, because I had wondered how you got from Texas here, but it was through Duke and your field ed internships, I guess. And you started out, you served a couple of 2-point charges, and then you served what I would consider maybe a county seat church. But you're in a really different setting now. You're in a much more mission-oriented setting. It was a new church start. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that journey and how you navigated that and even kind of made the switch along the way.
Sure. Well, I started in a 2-point charge because that's where the cabinet appointed me. So I really had no say in that. I grew up in the city of Dallas. And then for my first appointment, they sent me to a place that was 30 minutes from the nearest grocery store. So I was a fish out of water living rurally, but I liked it. So my first appointment was at Glencoe and Bethany, and Glencoe went station, and I stayed there with them for a few years after they went station. And then the cabinet rewarded me by sending me to another 2-point charge. And those two churches went station as well. They were rural as well. And that's when I went to the county seat church. Again, this is where I was appointed. I didn't have really much say in this at all. During this time, my wife, I stayed in North Carolina because I met my wife, Susan, at divinity school at Duke. And when we decided to get married, she said, I don't want to live in Texas. And I said, I do not want to live in Mississippi. And so we decided to stay out in North Carolina in the Western Conference because we loved it. During this time, especially when I was at the county seat church, she started to decline health-wise, and over a period of about 10 years really went downhill and then ended up going into hospice and dying. And the last year that she was in hospice, she actually was in hospice for over 2 years. When she first went in, they said she'd have a month to live, and then she ended up living for over 2 years in hospice. Her last year, I decided to take a leave, and the church I was at was building a family life center. My kids were, I think, 3 and 4 and 7 at the time. They were very young, and it just became too much. And so I decided to take a leave from the ministry, which was very, very hard for me. It was hard to admit I'm overwhelmed. It was hard for me to admit to myself, I can't do it. I can't be the pastor I want to be, and the dad I want to be, and the husband I want to be. And so the thing that had to go was the church, which is a decision I've never regretted from doing that. But I also at the time was so angry at God because Susan was suffering quite a bit, and I wasn't sure I'd come back to the ministry at all. I had some real issues with God, and to be totally honest, I still have some issues with God around the idea of suffering, and I can explain all of it theologically, but from my heart, I still have several questions to ask Jesus when I get to the pearly gates.
Sure.
But I took a leave of absence, wasn't sure if I would come back, and during that time, I realized that God wasn't done with me yet, and I wasn't done with God yet, but I wanted to do things in a really different way. I thought there needed to be a church for people who were really broken. I have found in my own experience, and I bet a lot of people who are listening to this will find this as well, that church often is one of the places where we are not our most authentic. That we walk into church and it seems like everybody else has all of their junk together. And so we feel embarrassed to say that we don't. And we see everybody else praising God and talking about how great God is. And we may have our doubts or our struggles, but we don't want to voice those because it seems like everybody else, his faith is at 100%. And of course, that's not true.
Right.
We all go. What I've learned is everyone is broken. Just some of us have enough money to cover it up better than others.
Or we don't have what it takes internally to acknowledge it to ourselves and others sometimes.
That's exactly right. Or we're embarrassed to. And so I realized there needs to be a church for people who are openly broken. And so I went and talked to the bishop and said, I'd like to be a part of starting this new church. And thanks be to God, the bishop went for it. And that's kind of how New Story started. We started with a couple of people who came with me, a few people who came with me from the county seat church, a few people who were coming from a church called Hillsdale United Methodist, which was instrumental in helping us get started. And we started off meeting in a hotel meeting room. And we would go in there, and right across the hall from the meeting room we were meeting in was a water slide in this hotel. So we'd hear kids screaming and laughing, and we would sing. And right from the beginning, we started saying, we want to be a church for broken people, people who are broken emotionally, people who are broken physically. and people who are broken spiritually. And of course, as I look back now, I realized what I was doing was creating a church that would help me as well. And so that's kind of how New Story started and how I got to that point.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that story. It's been quite a journey for you. And I think there's so many people that can, when you're honest and really kind of vulnerable and transparent in your journey, it helps other people connect and be able to be the same way. So I just want to say thank you for being willing to share that.
Thanks. I appreciate that.
So just one more thing to kind of follow up with that. You talked about some distance from God and some questions for God, and yet you have stayed grounded, and you're in ministry, and you've continued to be faithful in your leadership. And I wonder if you have a scripture or a theological foundation that you might consider kind of what keeps you grounded and keeps you guided on most days.
Well, I think the theological concept is that God's grace is available to everyone. And I also love the story of the prodigal son. We can't run away from God's grace. It's just always there with us. I love the story of the 4 men who carry the paralytic to the top of the roof. And for so long, I had thought of myself as one of the 4 people carrying the paralytic to the top of the roof to help him see Jesus. It was one of the most powerful things in my life when one day I realized, wow, I've had a lot of times in my life where I've been the paralytic. And thanks be to God that other people carried me up and helped me see Jesus, because for a while, especially when Susan was at her worst physically, it was very hard for me to see Jesus. And
Yeah, I'm sure.
it was so hard. And thankfully, I've got really great friends who would surround me and say, we know you don't have faith right now. We'll have faith for you. And they literally carried me through. Even when I was punching them in the face as they were trying to help me see Jesus, even when I was kicking them, throwing dirt in their face, saying, I don't want to. And I think that's when I've began to realize just how important community is. So often, especially being from Texas, it's easy to think, oh, we're lone rangers. We can do it all ourselves. We don't need anybody else. It's kind of the Texas motif.
Right.
Well, the truth is, as Christians, we do, because there are times that we are very strong in our faith and we can help carry others. And there are times that we are very weak in our faith and we need to be carried. And the people who I've come to distrust the most are those who talk about how their faith is strong all the time.
Right.
Because I've never met anybody like that. And I've read a lot of great biographies and autobiographies about really spiritual people, and none of them were like that. And in fact, if I'm reading the Bible correctly, there was times Jesus wasn't like that as well. And so I've come to realize just how important community is. And so that's one of the things we focused on a lot at New Story is we're here for you. And just because you're going through a tough time doesn't mean you have to leave church. Just because you've relapsed doesn't mean you have to. You had an affair, stay at the church. You got caught at your job embezzling. We're still here for you. And so that goes back to the main theological concept that I believe and that we base New Story on, is that God's grace is literally available to everyone, even when you are sinning like crazy, even when you're punching God in the face saying, let me go, let me go, let me go. God's grace is still right there surrounding you, even when you can't see it. And of course, to put this in Wesleyan terms, we'd say prevenient grace in some ways,
Right.
wouldn't we?
Right. It's especially, not only even, but especially when you can't see it. That's the role of the community of faith. And that's why we need you and want you to be among us.
Exactly.
So I want to shift a little bit to talking about leadership, because when you do a new thing, like you have especially, but also through the experiences you've just had over all your ministry in leadership, I think you have not only from your perspectives at New Story or things that are not just specific to New Story, but that can be really translated to leadership in any kind of church, any size church or other ministry. And I was listening to this podcast. It was a podcast called A Bit of Optimism with Simon Sinek and Jenna Arnold. And there was an idea in it I wanted to kind of run by you and see how you've experienced it or what you think about it. They were talking about the best leaders are the ones who are extremely comfortable in the gray. And what they mean is kind of the space between binary choices like black and white, yes or no, right or wrong, that we mostly in our society right now live in those kind of binary choices. But leaders need to be comfortable in the gray. And I wondered if you could just talk about how you've lived that out in your experience and kind of what that means to you.
Sure. When you read that question, It instantly made me think of Richard Rohr, who almost says the exact same thing, that second half living is always living in the gray, much less, maybe a few black and white things, but much more so living in the gray, which I think is something that comes a little bit easier as we get older. I know when I was younger in the ministry, I was much more black and white on things. I was much less willing to listen to other people's opinions because I thought, well, I've been to divinity school. Therefore, I've got the right answers. How dare you tell me, that you think that's what the Bible means? As I've gotten older in the ministry, and especially as I've ministered now to all types of people, I realize none of us hold all of the truth ourselves. The truth is always in the middle. The truth is almost always in the gray. And so as I've learned that very often the hard way, what I've learned is that like you said, I think the best leaders are those who are in the gray because they're seeking opinions from people who are very on the black side and very on the white side. They're listening to all kinds of different voices. And what I found in my own life, again, the hard way, is when I cement my feet in the black or in the white, it makes it much harder for me to change. And I may continue making bad decisions, using something like confirmation bias. I may have the idea that I'm absolutely right. And so then I only listen to ideas that confirm what I'm already thinking. The second I do that, I become a poor leader because God himself may be trying to get through to me saying, this isn't the right thing. And I'm saying, I'm sorry, I don't have time here. I'm too busy changing the world for you to listen to you. And so I do think the best leaders, and not only do I feel like I'm the best leader when I'm in the gray, I like to now follow people who live in the gray. I think one of the things that all of us have seen in the past few months of COVID, especially given the political situation of the world, is social media is almost all black or white. You're on this side or you're on that side. And I know it breaks my heart when I see people who I know and respect who are like, I'm willing to die on this hill, but it's not a hill that we should be willing to die on. And so I think of leaders who I most respect now are people who are saying, let's find common ground. Let's find where we can work together. I mean, I think we would all agree our country would be so much better off. Of course, Republicans and Democrats have different ideas, but I think most of the country is saying, find some ways to work together on this really important stuff. Well, I've been in churches where you had different groups who totally disagreed with each other and were more interested in fighting each other or getting their own way than feeding hungry kids or taking care of homeless people. And so I've realized, especially at the leader of News Story, we just don't have time to spend fighting each other. And since the beginning, I've preached on this over and over. Let's never spend any time fighting each other. Let's fight things like hunger in kids. Let's fight things like homelessness. Let's fight things like Satan. Let's fight the important battles, and in everything else, try to find common ground.
Yeah, and so I really like that, Scott, because if you can, it's sort of along the lines of you can keep the main thing, and bring people on board with that, then some of the other stuff just doesn't matter to what you're doing. And if that's their main thing, it might not be the right place for them. And you talk about that in the book around core values. And I wanted to read, if I could, because you talk through a process of how you identified your core values and then kind of how you've stuck to them. And so you have, it's on page 32, but it's the guiding principles you use to find your core values. And there are 4 of them. The first is they had to be sustainable for the long term and couldn't be only based on feelings. We hope they would continue to be our foundation for decades in the future. 2 is they had to be values that would hold true for us, whether we were thriving or struggling to survive. 3, they couldn't be wish lists. They had to be things we were already doing and committed to doing in the future. And 4, they had to be specific to us. We couldn't just copy them from another church and make them ours. There's just so much truth in all of that. And as leaders of churches, I think trying to figure out what your core values are and then align people around them and then keep them in front of you is significant to being a leader and for a church. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about your experience and tell us how you use those 4 determining factors to come to your core values, and then how have you kept people focused on them?
Sure. Great question. We held off trying to define core values for as long as we could. We had been meeting for months, but as we started to grow, and we were growing pretty quickly, and we had different people coming in with all kinds of different ideas, that was the beginning impetus. When you're 10 people meeting in a hotel meeting room, it's a lot easier to all be on the same page. When suddenly you're 50 or 60 people meeting in a bowling alley, which is where we met, we went from the hotel room to my living room to a bowling alley. And in the bowling alley is when we really started to grow. When you have 50 or 60 people coming, all with different ideas about what you should be doing, how you should be spending money, who should be in leadership, all those different things, that's when we realized, okay, it's time for us to set down some core values. And our leadership team, which at the time was 4 people and myself, all read a book together that was wildly helpful to us. It was called The Advantage by Patrick Lencioni.
Yeah.
And it was an amazing book that helped us think through this. And Lencioni has this great line in there. He says, you'll know you have a core value right when you're willing to suffer for it. And so what we did is we got together and we started, just as our leadership team, talking about, I was very adamant as we started doing core values, it's let's look at the things we're already doing. What are the things that intuitively we've been doing, that inherently we have been already doing? Because I now go to a lot of different churches and speak different places. Well, I did before COVID hit, but I'm always amazed when you see, usually at the front of the church, a great big long thing that says mission statement or core values. And it's like 40 different things all written in this grandiose language. And nobody at the church can even tell you what they are. And what we wanted at New Story is we wanted it to be very, very simple. We wanted it to be grounded in the things that we were doing. And like you just read from the book, we wanted it not to be something where it would be blown by the wind, tossed by the sea. Well, this month, this will be our core value. Next month, this will be our core value. We wanted something, of course, Jesus is the absolute rock, but we wanted some core values that we could hold on to, because even from the beginning, we knew at New Story we would have some really rocky patches. Because of the people who we serve, because of the financial situation that our church is always in, being a mission church, we knew that we would have tough times. And so we really wanted things that we could grab hold of and then try to run our decisions through those things. And so, like I said, we knew there would be times we would be struggling and times that we were thriving. And we wanted the core values to be able to be applicable during all of those times. I think the biggest one for us, though, was number 3, where it couldn't be wish lists. We couldn't say,
not
well,
aspirational.
Exactly. We couldn't write down, we want to have the best men's group and women's group and children's group and youth group and all, we didn't even have those things when we were starting. Could we aspire that to one day? Yes. But what we knew we were really good at, and what we knew all the people who were coming to New Story, why they were coming, is for a couple of reasons. One, everybody was welcome at New Story. We just, everybody was. I mean, since the beginning, we've had criminals and tons of people in recovery and people who've had multiple affairs and all kinds of things. And we had been and wanted to welcome them in. And we knew we were called to be a church that would reach out to broken people. Like I said earlier, physically and emotionally, and especially spiritually. And so we took things we were already doing and said, this seems to be important to us. How do we kind of codify this?
So one thing that occurs to me is, so you kind of developed all of this from the ground up, and you had people kind of on board with your vision and mission, at least to some degree from the very beginning. I feel like there'll be a lot of leaders who are listening to this, who are serving, more traditional kinds of settings, that want to be able to say the same thing. Everybody is welcome, no matter what. We want you to be here. But that there might be other people who aren't on board with that yet. So given that you've served more traditional churches prior to New Story, do you have any words of thought or insight on how you begin to shift the nature? I mean, that is who we are as the body of Christ. There's a place for everyone. Our churches don't always reflect that. How can we move the dial on that sometimes?
That's a great question. I have found in my own experience Now, this is an area where a new church start is much easier than a traditional church. And I've served both. And it's certainly, there's a lot of really tough things about a new church start, but this is one area where it is much, much easier. For leaders who are in traditional churches, I think I would say this: you as the leader, you begin to live it out.
Mm.
You may have a lot of people who are against you. That's okay. You live out that everyone is welcome. You live out that you will minister to everyone. You live out, if it is important to you, that feeding kids is hungry to you or doing some sort of outreach is important to you. You live that out, but don't live it out with a sledgehammer. I have found that people don't like being hit over the head with a sledgehammer. They instantly get defensive. They instantly put their feet in cement, and they'll fight for the tradition much more. I know when I was at the county seat church, we wanted to start a contemporary service. They'd only had a traditional service. And there was a lot of younger people who wanted to start a traditional service, or start a contemporary service. And there was a lot of pushback from the older crowd. And so what we did is we tried to work around it. We said, okay, we won't start the contemporary service in the sanctuary. We'll start it in the fellowship hall. And what I had to do is go to some of the people who were most against it and say, could I just ask you to do one thing for me? Just one thing as your pastor. And they said, well, what is it? And I said, promise me you won't sabotage it. You don't have to be in favor of it. You don't have to like it. You don't ever have to come. But I really believe in my heart this is going to reach new people for Christ, people who the church is losing, young people. And I know if I said to you, would you like more young people in the church? You would say yes. So will you just promise me not to sabotage it? And every single time they just smiled, because how could you say no to that? No, I don't promise. I won't. I'm going to go behind your back and try to sabotage this thing. And so I think sometimes we just have to take really small steps and take small victories. But I do think the most important thing is living it out yourself. And I think in any church, there are people who will be aligned with you. So for example, if you're leading a church that doesn't do much outreach ministry, but you can look not far down the road and see that there are really hungry people. It doesn't have to be your church that starts a feeding ministry. Find 5 or 6 people in your church who have a heart for it. Find a way to raise a little bit of money, and the 5 or 6 of you go down and start feeding people. That word will spread. Other people will get on board. And even if 95% of your church was against it, you'll still be doing what you feel God is leading you to do. And I do believe that God blesses that. And I believe that over time, doing that softens even the hardest of hearts.
Yeah, Scott, I think that is so helpful. As we make seminary visits and we hear people that are coming into ministry fresh and new, and recognizing kind of the way the United Methodist system works, they're going to end up, at least in their early appointments, probably in more traditional churches. But they have such a heart for mission and for service and for justice and for things that they may or may not find as being priorities in the places that they will serve, especially early in their ministry. And so what you've just offered is a vision for, so if there is some difference between kind of the congregation and the setting where they are and where their heart and passion is, how you can do both. And so I think that that's really helpful for people to kind of hear you talk a little bit about as possibilities.
And, I think there are times, and this isn't the most exciting aspect of ministry, but there's times you have to pay the piper. It's a lot easier to make change, for example, contemporary service, if you're out visiting the older people as well.
Right.
You can't just say, well, I'm called to justice ministries and feeding ministries, and so I'm not going to do any of the other parts of being a pastor. No, being a pastor means doing some of these other things. It means going to the men's meeting or the women's meeting and doing hospital visits and doing these things. That's I think as pastors what we're called to. And I think too often it's easy to neglect some of those things because it's much more exciting to start a feeding ministry than to do 5 hospital visits. And yet they're both equally important to the kingdom.
Yeah, and that's really part of the heart of pastoral ministry is being the pastor and developing those relationships. And you talked about it in a way that was strategic, but at the heart of it was the relationship that you developed with the older people and the people in your church to help them come along with some of the vision and growth that you had kind of in mind for that. There's a quote by Todd Bolsinger in Canoeing the Mountains, following up with this idea of relationships. It's about relational congruence. And he says, relational congruence is the leader's ability to cultivate strong, healthy, caring relationships, maintaining healthy boundaries, and communicating clear expectations, all while staying focused on the mission. And it sounds to me that like you kind of live that in your leadership. And there are multiple components to it, but you kind of have to do them all at the same time in order for kind of the ministry to move forward. Do you have any experiences that you would share with us around that?
Well, I think that's a great sentence. I also think in some ways it's utopian.
Oh, well, yeah.
We could do all four of those at the same time. That would be amazing. I do think it's really important, like you just read, to start with cultivating the strong, healthy, caring relationships. At every church I've gone into, the first thing I would do when I would get there is go out and meet people and ask them, tell me your story, and learn their stories, learn who they are. Because if you come in and on day one say, I'm changing this and that in the service and we're starting this and this ministry, they're not going to know that you care about them at all. And I found it's a lot easier to affect change when you know the people well and when you can talk in terms of how this could be important to them or how this might help them as well. So I think starting with the caring relationships, we've all been in relationships where we thought the person was just using us for something. And we're almost always defensive against that, and it doesn't feel good. And I think that feels much worse when it's coming from a pastor in that, well, I'm just using you to get this new ministry started. Well, nobody likes that. So I think developing the healthy and caring relationships is really important. I love the boundary parts of that as well. I must admit, I'm a little bit of a hypocrite here because there are times I have had not nearly strong enough boundaries, especially when we were starting New Story Church. When we started New Story Church, we literally made every mistake you could possibly make in terms of helping people because our hearts were in the right place, but we did not do it in effective ways. And so we would give people money when we absolutely shouldn't have. We would help people in ways that we shouldn't have. And unfortunately, we learned how to have boundaries the hard way. And every time it was by getting a sledgehammer to the face. And we realized, whoa, that was not effective. That was not good. And so we have come to realize that very often the most loving thing we can say is no. Or the most loving thing we can say is, no, we won't do that, but we will do this. And we have people get so angry at us. We have people tell us we're not Christians, we're not a church, this and that. But we've learned we actually are caring for you, even if you don't know that we're caring for you. The clear expectation parts is fantastic. Brene Brown has that great quote, clear is kind. Mm-hmm. Well, I've been then very unkind a lot through my ministry. When you think you're being kind, especially with staff people or with key leaders, and you think you're being kind by not telling them the brutal facts or not letting them know, hey, this isn't effective or you're not doing this well, you think you're being kind, but actually it's a form of cruelty, I think. And so I think being very clear, especially with staff and key leaders, here's what we expect from you. And what we've learned at News Story is to tell people, here's what we expect from you, and here's what you can expect from us. And that way, it's not just a one-way street. It's not just using people. It's not just saying, well, we need you to do this, 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 and this, and then they do it until they're burned out and quit.
Sounds like a covenant relationship.
It is. Nice. That's exactly what it is. And so it's being clear, here's what we expect from you, and here's what you can expect from us, and let's love each other enough that if somebody is falling through on their part, we'll talk to each other about it. And those conversations aren't easy. Even for someone like me who is not conflict avoidant, those are still hard conversations because people don't always take them really well. And then, of course, staying focused on the mission. I think that's the most important thing. Why are we here? What are we doing? The military has this phrase, mission creep. You start off doing one thing and then suddenly 6 months later, you're off doing something absolutely, totally different that has nothing to do with why you started that. We've been tempted to do that at News Story as well. We know one of our core values is we'll keep it simple. And Thank goodness that's one of our core values, because there have been times we have almost started down paths that would have taken us in directions that have nothing to do with who we are.
Good
Because we were
ideas or good intentions, but not focused on who you are.
absolutely, we lost a lot of people in the beginning because we didn't have a great youth program. And man, I wanted to do whatever it took to get one, but we just weren't ready for it. We didn't have the leaders, we didn't have the funding. And I eventually just started saying to people, here's a great church down the road that has an amazing youth program, and realizing that that is still a kingdom victory. It might have been a news story victory, but it was a kingdom victory. Well, now we do have great youth programs, but it's taken us, years and years to get those, but focusing on the mission, because in every church I've ever been in, not everybody, but a lot of people have ideas of great things they'd like to see the church do. And by the church, they mean the pastor and staff.
Right.
And so we have to be real clear. Here's who we are. News story, we don't do many things, but we try to do the things we do really, really well. And so we do worship well. We do feeding ministries well. We do homeless ministries really well. And then we try to do children's and youth ministries really well. And that's it. And we have people all the time coming saying, we think we should start this. We think we should start that. And we say, great, you go start that, and we will try to help you as a church, but we're not going to take that on. And again, that makes a lot of people mad, but it's some of the best decisions we've ever made.
Yeah, you do talk about that in the book. And it was something I particularly appreciated, because you're not saying it's not important. You're not saying you shouldn't do that. We agree this is a good idea, but it's empowering the laity, and it's empowering them to take some ownership and to discover their own gifts through it, and then to live it out and implement it in the ways, maybe get other people around them to do it. You're still honoring that, but you're at the same time staying focused on the mission of the church and what your leadership in your church has decided. This is who we are, and this is what we're good at and what we need to do. I really appreciate that.
And it's one of the beautiful things about how God has created the church. Different churches have strengths in different areas, and no church can be everything to everyone. And so now I encourage people sometimes to go to different churches if they have a certain need that we can't meet. And I can say, well, this church over here does that really, really well.
Yeah, that's really helpful. It's hard to lose people. It's hard for leaders to kind of own that, because it somehow feels like it reflects on them. And yet we are the body of Christ. We are the kingdom collectively, not individually. Scott, in hearing you talk so much about your leadership and making hard decisions and staying focused, and it takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of time. And you have always struck me as somebody that's all in. And so whether it's ministry and work, or whether it's probably play in your downtime, that you're just all in. And I wonder if you could talk to us about how you do some self-care, and how do you create Sabbath, in whether it's moments, days, or it's hard for ministry leaders often to make that a priority. And I wonder if you could share with us how you might do that.
Yeah, I'm not the greatest person to ask about this.
That's why I'm asking you.
That's right. Well, as I was hearing your question, I thought, what? I am all in on work, and I am all in on play. Where I have miserably failed is being all in on rest, being all in on Sabbath. For me, I'm someone who likes to be going and doing. I'm not someone who can sit down and meditate for 2 hours at a time. I'm not someone who can sit and pray for 45 minutes at a time. And one of the biggest growth areas in my own life was realizing, what? That's okay. God created you as you are. And so I will pray as I'm mowing the yard. It's one of my best prayer times when I'm outside. I'll pray when I go hiking. I've realized that spending wonderful time with my family is also a ministry. And so now if I have blown it in my ministry, I have blown it in terms of at times working too hard. It's one of the things that we as ministers do. And like you said, Kim, we like to have the idea that we are needed. Mm-hmm. We like to be liked. We want people to say, well, he or she was just a great pastor. And I guess, given the experiences that I've gone through in my life, losing my first wife, one thing I continuously think about is on my tombstone, I want it to say great husband, because I'm remarried to Joya. She's just a wonderful woman. I want it to say great husband and great father before it says great pastor. And I think about that a lot because it's so easy to work ridiculously at places that 5 years from now won't even remember that you were their pastor.
Now move on to the next great pastor.
That's right. You'll be a picture on the wall. And most
literally.
people literally, and most people won't remember your name. And so, I think there are times to absolutely be all in at work. I think, especially in these COVID times, it's this new normal. It's hard to figure out, how do we work? I know in my own life, I've had to mentally gear myself up for work at times much more than I ever have before because it's just so different. But, for me, trying to take Sabbath, it's Rob Bell had in one of his books was talking about how he and his wife had to learn how to do Sabbath, that at first they would take an hour and they were so antsy they would get up and do stuff, but then they could take 2 hours, then they could take 3 hours. For me, what I have realized in order for me to truly take Sabbath is I have to literally get out of town. Now, that sounds pathetic, but I know if I am in town, most likely I'm going to be doing some kind of work, whether it's church news story work or it's working on projects or something at my house. So for me to literally take downtime, I have to get out of town, even if it's 30 minutes away, and go hike. I have to, again, this is pitiful, I have to literally turn off my phone. Because if I'm in the other room and hear my phone going off within the next 15 minutes, I'm going to walk in and check it.
It provides too much anxiety if you don't.
That's exactly right. And so I'll be sending a work text, responding to a work text at 10 o'clock at night. What on earth? But the other thing is, I think we teach people how to treat us. And so if we respond to texts at 10 o'clock at night, if we take work phone calls that are not emergencies at 9 o'clock at night, we teach people that that's okay.
Yeah.
And so I've learned just to turn off the phone. And at first when I did it, I was so anxious. I was like, I might be missing something. But then I realized,
yeah, really you weren't, right?
I wasn't. And when I don't have my phone in my pocket, I'm a much more active listener. I actually hear what my kids are trying to tell me.
Yeah.
I'm actually spending quality time with Julia. And of course, I think probably for all of us, the best Sabbath thing we could do is get off social media 95% of the time. I've just found it's not helpful for me. It's not helpful. Usually if I spend any time scrolling through Facebook, I just end up mad because people who I respected posted something I totally don't respect.
And you disagree with, and
Exactly.
So you're in a tizzy now.
Exactly. So I think everyone has to figure out what it is for themselves, but we can't use that as a cop-out to not try to figure it out.
And that reminds me, Scott, I had totally forgotten, but you talked about this. So you have a podcast that you started late last year, I think, and seems that there's one a month until COVID hit and you haven't been able to do it again. But you actually have a podcast. You and some of your good clergy friends talk about this specific thing. And until I heard you say this, I'd forgotten that. And each of you shares kind of how you approach it differently. And when I listened to it, I really appreciated it because we are wired differently. And that's where if I'd ask somebody who was really, really good at Sabbath and really, really good at, we know the people that are really good at it. It's for those of us who find it more challenging or that we have to be more creative in it that it's helpful to hear from. So I was going to reference that podcast, your podcast anyway, because I found it to be so authentic and just really easy to relate to. It's called Learn and Burn, but it reminds me you did a podcast on that. So I really appreciated it. As we're kind of running out of time, I really want to talk just a little bit more about the book because I really appreciated it. You offer a lot of stories in there, a couple that I really wanted us to talk about. So I'm going to just ask you to share one of them because when I heard about it happening, I had met Steve at a leadership training event prior to that and was just really just worried and wondered how you all would manage. So Steve was on staff and got shot in the middle of being at church. Would you just tell a little bit about that story and how you moved beyond that?
Sure. This was at our Walltown campus. If you're not familiar with Winston-Salem, Walltown is one of the toughest areas of Winston-Salem. We have worship there on Monday nights, and right across the street from our campus is a check cashing store. And right at the end of the service, Steve Smith, great man. He was our outreach pastor for a long time. He's now serving his own churches in our conference. Steve and I were standing at the back of the sanctuary when we heard a loud pop. And we didn't know at the time, but there had been a gunfight at the check cashing place across the street. And one of the bullets came through our sanctuary and hit Steve in the back of the head. By an absolute miracle, before it hit Steve, it traveled long ways through a 1x6 piece of wood, which slowed it down and then hit Steve's head at an angle. And so it just cracked his skull. It didn't go into his brain. And the doctor said that's what saved his life.
Wow.
We had only been worshiping out at Waltown. We'd only taken that campus over a few months before that. I think we had been worshiping out there maybe 3 months. And this was one of our biggest fears because Waltown was such a dangerous area. And we had a leadership team meeting that week. And I talk about all of this in the book. It was a very formative time for our church. We had leadership team meetings that week trying to decide, should we continue worshiping out there or not? Will anybody come back to worship out there or not? And we decided that if we didn't continue worshiping out there, we'd have to change the name from New Story Church. We believe with all of our heart that God was leading us to have a campus there. And that was at the core of it. And so we said, we have to worship. Well, Steve was out of the hospital a few days later, and a week later on that next Monday night, Steve and Joy, my wife, and I drove out there together. We didn't know if there'd be anybody out there to worship. And on that Monday night, it was absolutely packed with people from the community. And still now, years later, people say that's when we knew that New Story Church was here for this community. Because in the past, so many churches had kind of done drive-by ministry. They'd drive by, serve a meal, and then leave. And people knew, and people still talk about it today. And that has become one of the core stories for who we are as a church.
It's like a defining moment.
A very defining moment. And that, we will stay. We will stay and do ministry. Are there times I'm scared out at Waltown? There are, if I'm being brutally honest. There are times that it's a very, very rough area. And yet I feel personally like it's some of the best ministry I've ever been a part of, because you're literally feeding kids who would have nothing to eat. You're literally loving on people who all day long have been told they are nothing. We do baptisms out there. We blow up an inflatable pool and we literally just do baptisms out there. Of course, we'll sprinkle if you want to, but we do it in the pool as well. And last year we baptized 50 people out there, people from the community. And I don't mean that as a number bomb. I mean that as they know that we're part of that community. And I think a lot of them have literally no idea exactly what baptism is, but they know somehow it's going to bring them closer to God. And we do it. And so it's great.
Well, I appreciate you telling that story, because I think it's indicative to me in reading your book, and the subtitle of the book is For Those Who've Ever Wanted to Give Up, Throw Up, or Not Even Show Up while trying to transform the world. And it's just a great story of how New Story and the leadership team and under your leadership really have tried to transform the world in the place where you are, where you serve, where you are, where you live, in the opportunities that you've been given, and that you've been in it for the long haul. There's so much about your book that I think is relatable for people in any ministry setting, any kind of situation. Really teaches a lot about leadership. I'm going to put in the show notes the link to your website, which has the book and the podcast and other ministry resources that you all are offering. We do have it in the resource center at the conference center, though. And so you can borrow it from there. So I'll put the link to that as well, so people could get the book through the conference resource center, which is going to open back up on August 1st. So it'll be available then.
And it's on Kindle Kindle and on print on Amazon, Renegade Minitsry. If you like me, like to read things on Kindle.
Well, I have to say I'm not really one who does that. So thank you for mentioning that.
Sure.
And I wonder, just as we finish up, is there anything else that you were hoping to share with us, or any final thoughts?
I would just want to say to anyone who's listening, you can do it. New Story Church is a perfect example that you can do it. We are not rocket scientists. We are not the most faithful people on earth. Most of us who are in leadership at New Story had left church, or thinking about leaving church, or were never part of church. And I say that to say what we are doing, certainly you don't want to try to model your ministry after exactly what we are doing. that would be impossible and not faithful to who God's calling you to be. But if we can do it, you can do it. I tell people all the time, it's a miracle that New Story Church continues to exist with me as the pastor and the different leaders that we have, which is just goes to show, God can do anything. And so I think during these COVID times, I talk to a lot of ministers, and there's a lot of depression. There's a lot of feeling of hopelessness. There's a lot of feeling of helplessness. There's not a lot of things that we can grab hold of like we used to. So what I would say is, don't give up. Use this time in ways to get some good rest, because when we get back to whatever a new normal is going to be, it's probably going to take a lot of energy and a lot of thinking and a lot of time. So use this time for some good rest. But also what I've been doing is just praying during this time. God, show me what you have in store for the future of us. God, the church isn't going to be the same after this. Show me how to lead during this time. Show us as a church what to do. And I think God will be faithful to that. So I would just say to everybody, I think our best ministerial days are ahead of us. Are they going to be tough? They are. Is it going to be different? It is. But God called you to this. And just because of COVID, God hasn't left you through this. And so, my prayers are with you. And I guess I would say, you can reach me at scott@newstorychurch.org. I talk to people all the time. So feel free to email me and we can talk about ideas, or we can talk about whatever you want. But, just know that you aren't in this alone, and we're all in this together. And thankfully, we worship a God who, even in the midst of this craziness, still holds all of us in God's hand.
Thank you so much, Scott. I have really enjoyed this conversation and appreciate you sharing your story and New Story story, and just helping us to get some glimpses of leadership and ideas through it. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Kim.
Thank you for listening to Means of Grace, a podcast produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church. We hope you enjoy listening to these podcasts and use them as a way to stay connected to our community. Remember to subscribe to Means of Grace for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please leave us an honest rating and a review. It helps others find this podcast. Follow the WNCC on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at WNCCUMC. Once again, that's at WNCCUMC. Means of Grace is produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church and Andy Go of Gojo Studios.